And I work for Southern Tier Central. My job title is Flood Mitigation Specialist, which means it's my job to help anybody in this 3-county region with any issue related to flooding that they want help with. So one of the current issues facing us has to do with updating our very old FEMA floodplain maps. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. So that's the agenda, maps that we have, what's coming, and how will our levees be mapped. Is there a remote?
I can also. You just let me know when you want me.
Okay. So why am I starting with flood insurance? I promised to talk to you about maps, not flood insurance. The reason we have maps is because of the National Flood Insurance Program. NFIP, as it's called, is a voluntary program based on mutual agreement between the federal government and local communities. So back in the 60s, private industry got out of the business of being willing to sell flood insurance. It just was not financially feasible for them. Federal government took it on with the National Flood Insurance Program. And the reason the federal government decided they could do better than private industry was because they were not only going to sell flood insurance, but any municipality, well, first they were going to develop floodplain maps. So there would be some data about where the flood risks were and how bad they were in different areas. And that would help them to price policies appropriately. And flood insurance would only be available in communities where the community adopted and enacted floodplain regulations. So the theory was that over the long run, all new development would be built in a manner that's protective of flooding. So over time, the amount of flood damages would reduce. We haven't seen that trend, but this is a program we still work under. So this is why we have floodplain maps, to support the insurance program and to support local regulations. Next. So what are FEMA floodplain maps? They're designed to show the areas that are likely to flood. And some terminology, bad terminology, but it's what we use nonetheless. Base flood is a flood with a 1% probability of being equal or exceeded in any given year. And it's determined by hydrologic and hydraulic modeling. So it's a theoretical, statistical flood. We used to call it the 100-year flood, but it doesn't come around every 100 years. And that was confusing. So they decided to change it to the 1% annual probability flood, which is no clearer. But so I will use those terms a little bit interchangeably. Special flood hazard area is what we call the flood zone, the regulated floodplain. It's the area that's covered by the base flood. It's also called the 100-year floodplain. And then the base flood elevation is how high that 100-year flood or base flood will be. So those are the things the maps want to show, are designed to show us, is where it will flood and how deep it will flood. So inside of the special flood hazard area, development needs to be covered by a floodplain development permit from the local community. We enforce the minimum federal standards plus some higher standards that are also included in New York's residential and building codes. And within this floodplain, there are mandatory flood insurance purchase requirements. So any building that's secured by a federally backed mortgage or that has received some other form of federal assistance is required to carry flood insurance if that building is located in the highest risk, high risk floodplain, special flood hazard area. So that's why it matters whether you're in or out of the floodplain, is your development requirements and your insurance requirements. Floodplain maps can also show 500-year floodplain, so-called areas of moderate flood risk. It's the 2% annual probability floodplain. And it may also show the floodway, and that's the channel of the river and the adjacent areas that needs to be reserved to pass, to let the flood water pass without backing up the water and causing increased flooding on the neighboring areas. So there are higher development standards, higher requirements in the floodway area adjacent to the channel, only in those streams for which it was mapped. Next. Floodplain maps don't show all of our flood hazards. Doesn't show flooding from water that hasn't made it to the creek yet. So when they have urban drainage problems, road ditches that are inadequate that back up. Doesn't show flooding from debris or ice jam. That flooding is not on the maps. It is about water, what's going to get wet from a flood, not what's going to be eroded by a flood. So we get erosion damage. It's not addressed on those maps. And there can always be a bigger or worse flood than the model flood that was shown on the maps. So the different kinds of maps, the flood hazard and flood boundary maps were the first generation of floodplain maps. They theoretically don't exist anymore because they were replaced by flood insurance rate maps, which are our current maps. But some communities simply got a letter saying, you're now supposed to call your old flood hazard and flood boundary map flood insurance rate map. And some communities also have a flood boundary and floodway map. In the 70s and 80s, they showed the floodway on a separate map, different from basically the flood insurance rate map. And digital flood insurance rate maps we don't have yet. We'll get to those in the what's coming part of this presentation. And along with that, FEMA now develops other non-regulatory products, and we'll talk a little bit about those in the what's coming section. So some examples of floodplain maps that we now have. This is it's the map index. So if more than one panel is printed for a community, there'll be a map index like this. And the asterisks show the panels that are not printed because there was determined to be no flood hazard in those parts of the town. This is an old flood hazard and boundary map. It was developed created in 1974. This is a small print that you can't read on the slide. It was developed in 1974, revised in 1975, and then it was converted to a flood insurance rate map by letter in 1988, and there have been no changes since. So the community still regulates based on this map. Next slide. And that's the next page. That's the map. 100-year floodplain is shown in gray. It's on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. The scale makes it really hard to use. The distortion of the base map that it's on makes it hard to use. Lack of landmarks make it hard to use. But the community has a legal obligation to regulate any new development within that gray area. If you can't find where you are on the map, often you need to ask the applicant to get a surveyor to make that determination, because community doesn't want to make a mistake. And you don't want to require things that aren't necessary because you said it was in, and you don't want to let them build low if it's out, and then if you think it's out, but FEMA doesn't. So surveyor will use their expertise to maybe make a determination, or they may work with the property owner to submit to FEMA what's called a letter of map amendment, and then FEMA will make the determination of whether the existing building or the proposed building site is in or out of floodplain. Next. This community did get a new map issued, but it looks just like the old one, but it's not called a flood insurance rate map. You notice these maps, they're what we call an approximate A zone. There's just the floodplain is labeled zone A, and there are no base flood information here, so we don't know how high the flood water will be based on this map. Oops. Go ahead and do the next one. I got those in the wrong order. You'll see maps like this. It's nice to have the floodplain on a GIS format. You can see the floodplain in relation to the property line boundaries. You can see it in relation to the existing development. But this map was simply digitized from that awful map that I just showed you. So there were assumptions and approximations involved in that. This is not the legal flood insurance rate map. If we can't, you can use it for information, help you zero in on the right area, but you really need to use the paper map. And often you have to measure from the nearest road intersection, or maybe from a couple of road intersections. You can't know where you are by measuring from the stream because the map's 50 years old. Maybe the stream has moved in that time. Often the stream has moved. So next. Some communities have maps that are folded up like highway maps. So they're larger format. Still no landmarks to help you. On this one, the dark gray is the 100-year floodplain. There's some lighter gray around the edges that's labeled zone B. That's the 500-year floodplain. And then outside of the floodplain is zone C. So in the 500-year floodplain, the floodplain development standards don't apply. That's for information only to know that there is some flood risk there. And there's squiggly lines across there. Those are labeled as the base flood elevations. They're only to the nearest foot. And when we regulate floodplain development, we are required to regulate to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. And the map only shows approximately to the nearest foot what the base flood elevation is. But we need that to elevate the building properly in compliance with the elevation and protection standards. The floodway for this community, usually if a community has base flood elevations for a particular stream, there will also be a floodway determined. They do that as part of a detailed study. So this is the floodway shown on a separate map. Dark gray is the 100-year floodplain, light gray is 500-year floodplain, and the floodway includes the river and is shown in white. And outside of the floodplain is also shown in white. This is confusing, especially if there's a municipal boundary nearby. But these are the maps that we work with. So the next. And I said we need the flood, base flood elevation to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. If there has been a detailed study, there will be a flood insurance study that has some technical details about that, how the mapping was done, the modeling that was used. And in the back of that flood insurance study, there are a series of profiles for each stream that was studied by detailed methods. So next. So closer up on that profile, the vertical axis is elevation. Along the horizontal is the stream distance, not the straight stream distance, the winding stream distance as the stream curves or as it curved at the time this mapping was done. And then it shows you the elevations of the stream bed, 10-year, 50-year, 100-year, and 500-year flood. So next. So if we're 30 feet upstream of the Sutter Boulevard Bridge. The bridges are shown on this profile. So we could measure on the bottom axis to know where we are. Maybe we could find ourselves on the map in relation to one of the cross sections, which are shown on the map and labeled here A, B, and C. So once we find out where we are, find the 100-year flood line and the next. And we can determine the base flood elevation theoretically to the nearest 1/10 of a foot, plus or minus 1/10 of a foot or so act in reality. So this is another community that has the squiggly lines for base flood elevations, has 100-year floodplain, 500-year floodplain. Where it says levee on the right-hand side, the floodplain ends at a flood control levee. So the area protected by that levee is zone C. It's outside of the regulated floodplain. They also have a floodway map, which looks like this. If you can find the floodway on this map, you're doing better than I can. In theory, it's a white area between the gray areas on the edge of the floodplain. Maybe the entire floodplain is supposed to be floodway. This is kind of the ugly of the good, bad. Maybe we don't have any good. Maybe it's bad and ugly are the maps that we have. Next. And finally, FEMA figured out that they could show floodway and floodplain on the same map. So the better of the maps that we have the floodway shown in that cross hatched pattern, the diagonal lines. The floodplain is zone AE. They changed the names of these zones over time. 500-year floodplain is now labeled zone X. You can't see on this scan, but it should be a lighter gray than the shading on the 100-year floodplain. And then out of the floodplain is also zone X. So the 500-year floodplain is now called shaded zone X. Go figure. So we see that our maps are old, they're difficult to use, some more difficult than others. What's coming? FEMA and DEC initiated an effort to update our old floodplain maps. This is really long overdue. In theory, they evaluate maps for whether they need to be updated every 5 years. They're a long ways behind that schedule with us. Last month, in April, they came to town and held a series of what they call discovery meetings for this new mapping project. Risk map is what FEMA calls their floodplain mapping program now. And discovery is the first phase of that process next. So the project area that they're looking at, they wanted to map the watersheds that include all the land that drains into the Chemung River, Cohocton River, Canisteo River, and Tioga Rivers, plus enough other area to make them countywide mapping projects for Steuben and Chemung County. And then we wound up with only the western portion of Schuyler County, brings into Lamook and Juanita Lakes, that area. FEMA told us that future project in the very near future will be picking up the rest of Schuyler County. So discovery phase, the first phase of the mapping project, FEMA now wants to coordinate with watershed stakeholders. They held a webinar last summer. They distributed a survey asking us for information. Talk a little more about that in a moment. And they came to town, held a series of 4 meetings around the region to talk about this process, to show us some preliminary mapping to get feedback in person. This phase, they're also collecting all the data they can get, and any analysis, what information they already exist to help with the mapping and what are the mapping needs. They will issue a discovery report with this information and a series of maps. They said spring of 2024. I don't quite believe that, but hopefully we'll see that soon. And then this summer, they're hoping to develop a scope of work for what a future risk map project will look like. And both of those discovery report and the scope of work will be available to us to review and comment on before they finalize it. And they are hopeful of having a FEMA funded mapping project in 2026. But of course, that's subject to change. Never count on a federal budget working out how you want it to. And once they start a mapping project, it'll take about 3 years to get some final maps. So we will not see new maps for this region for the next 5 years. Sometime after that, we may have updated maps. So, floodplain mapping project will produce both the traditional products. Those are the maps that newer versions of the maps like we already have, flood insurance rate map, and the flood insurance study that goes with it. There will be digital maps. So there will also be what they call a DFIRM database. And that's the GIS information so that we can use that map information with our other GIS layers. So if we want to see it in relation to the parcel boundaries or an updated aerial photograph of what things look like on the ground, we can use that information in other ways. And they also now do some non-regulatory products. While they're going through all the work of building a model and looking closely at how water runs off of this watershed area, there are other things that they can fairly easily provide to us. Most commonly, and that varies with the project, but they almost always will give us water depths, because elevation we don't know until a surveyor tells us, but the depth off the ground is something that's much more meaningful to us. And also the velocities. Velocities are higher, there are safety issues that there are not in areas where the water moves slowly. Next. So this is what a digital firm flood insurance rate map looks like. The 100-year floodplain is shown in blue dots. There are black dots around the edge. You can see this on the bottom left. That's the 500-year floodplain. And then along the meandering river, you can see the cross-hatched area is the floodway. And it will show where the profiles are, just like the other one. And I think, yeah, there's a few squiggly lines showing us base flood elevations to the nearest foot. But now we have an aerial image underneath it to help us locate ourselves. And this will be a PDF in a version where you can turn on and off the layers so you can see what's underneath them. Or if you prefer paper, you can find somebody with a large plotter and we'll get it printed for you when we get there. So this is the letter that went with the survey that FEMA sent out. They're asking for data that we have locally that can help them improve the quality of their maps. Bridge information, if we have as-built for bridges, high water marks, they use that to calibrate their model. If we have planned, if we know that areas are going to be developed, or that we have some planned mitigation projects, those might be useful information for them to know. They also want our input on what actually needs to be mapped. Some areas they use approximate studies and techniques that they can do just from the computer, and areas where they do detailed studies, they have a little higher confidence in the quality, and those detailed studies produce base flood elevations. So are there areas where there currently are no mapped floodplains where there should be mapped floodplains? Are there areas that currently don't have detailed studies where that would be really helpful to have? Are there areas where the current maps are wrong? We have areas where the current maps are wrong. They'd like to know that. Some are obvious. They can tell when a floodplain ends at a municipal boundary and that there's something wrong there. But there are other things that they may not pick up on that they need us to help them with. Non-regulatory products. We can provide some feedback as to what we would like as far as non-regulatory products. Water depth and velocity information, I think we will get. They can map additional floodplain scenarios, like what's the 10-year floodplain? Maybe we want to manage what we do in that area that's going to flood so much more often in a different way than we are dealing with the other parts of the floodplain. Are there locations where they see there's opportunities to do some mitigation, maybe some development that's particularly at risk, either because it's critical facilities or infrastructure, or because there's just a lot of houses in an area that's got a high flood risk, and they might highlight those for possible mitigation. They, as they do the model, will see where our bridges and culverts are undersized and causing water to back up. They can highlight those. And they can develop some potential flood damage estimates and information that could help us to apply for mitigation funding to some of the data that we have trouble finding for those applications. That if we ask for it, we may be able to get some of that information as part of the mapping project. And a couple other things that I've asked and I got a maybe on are what are flood risks below dams? If that dam is to fail when it's full. Some places we have inundation mapping that's been done for the dam emergency action plan. Other places we may want that information. And the real risk for many of our streams, especially those when we get flash floods, is not so much the water, but the erosion. And is it possible for FEMA? They have the authority in the regulations, but they rarely do it, if at all. But can they map the erosion hazard areas for us, where the highest risks of erosion are, so that we can plan development accordingly? So DEC came to these meetings with what they call base level engineering maps. These are first cut rough draft mapping for the entire project area using the approximate techniques that can be done without any field surveys. So next, they shared these maps in paper format so we could look at them, and then they took them away. So we didn't get a long look, but they will be on an online mapper, they said sometime this summer, so that we can see what the rough draft mapping will look like. And this mapping is what will be used in the final flood insurance rate maps in the rural areas where they don't do detailed mapping studies. So there are two examples here that they included in their slide deck, and so I can share that with you. This is Hamlet of Woodhull, and the cross-hatched area is what is currently mapped as 100-year floodplain. No base flood elevations in this area. And the blue is what they're modeling. Their base level engineering modeling shows the 100-year floodplain ought to actually look like. So in this area, at least, we could see significant change in the map floodplain. But the people who lived through the tropical storm Floyd flood might tell us that that blue line is maybe more accurate as far as where the flood risk is, because we certainly had flooding very far beyond the existing map floodplain in this area. Next. This Tompkins Corners and town of Catlin and Chemung County, and here again the existing floodplain may not even follow up in the top area. It may not even follow where the current stream is. So that would show some potential for changing the floodplain boundaries in this area also. When we get these maps on online mapping format, mapper format, this is this online mapper for base level engineering maps in New York State. And this is the city of Olean, what that product will look like. But difficulty with our floodplain maps is that we've got levees. And when they reevaluate the flood risks, they will also reevaluate whether those levees are providing the 100-year protection and how to represent the areas that are protected on the map. So this is an online mapper that STC created. The brown lines are the levees, and you can click on each of those and get a pop-up window with some information about that levee. Most of the locations and information is from the National Levee Database, and additional information that we pulled out of FEMA presentations. So 55 miles of levee in the region. All of them will be reevaluated for whether they provide flood protection. Currently, all but a couple miles of those are shown on the flood insurance maps as providing protection from that 1% flood. Notable exception is Addison, where even in the 80s, they determined that the levees were not high enough to that flood. Next. So, because levees are an important issue, along with the discovery and the new mapping project, FEMA held a series of 5 meetings in February to talk about how those levees are going to be mapped on future flood insurance rate maps. So when FEMA looks at a levee, it's either, for mapping purposes, it's either accredited or it's non-accredited. So an accredited levee system is one that FEMA has determined will provide protection for the 1% flood. So is it high enough? Is it strong enough? Have all of the other requirements been met for FEMA to accredit it? But all that data that goes into that decision, FEMA doesn't develop that data. They just review it. They expect the local levee sponsor or the community to provide that data. It needs to be certified by a licensed professional. If a levee is accredited, then the levee impact area is shown on the flood insurance rate map as reducing the flood hazard, removing the protected area from that regulated 1% 100-year floodplain. If it's not accredited, all the documentation isn't available. They have some different techniques that they can use to map the areas that will be affected, but always they need some data about the structural soundness of the structure. So levee certification is a term we use to describe all the documentation that needs to be submitted to FEMA to either accredit a levee or to map it using one of their alternative techniques besides just mapping as though the levee isn't there. So it needs to be certified by a licensed professional, needs to include information about the height of the levee. Is it going to scour with the velocity of water? Is there likely to be erosion problems? Will there be backwater flooding where the water draining off the hill? Does that have a place to be stored when it can't get to the river because the river is high? Is there a good current operation and maintenance plan? Is there an emergency plan? All these things go into the certification. And as far as the height, they're looking at not only the height of the levee relative to the 1% flood plus freeboard, which is an additional measure of safety. That's there. So FEMA isn't going to collect this data. They will look for any existing data that exists. That's their current project. What their objective is to find what already exists. Most of the levees in this region were built by the Corps of Engineers. A lot of that work was done in the 1940s. They're old structures. The data may not exist that FEMA is looking for. And so the next people we would look to would be either the Corps of Engineers or DEC. DEC maintains most of the levees. The Corps maintains the Hornell system and Cutler Creek system in Corning. DEC has said that they won't certify our levees. Corps of Engineers has some programs. There may be some cost sharing. One of our to-do lists is to learn more about how much help can we really get from these agencies on this effort. And I think there's a lot of local frustration. Why does it this fall? The local communities who, yes, we have protection from the levees, they benefit us, but we don't have the expertise or the deep pockets. I mentioned deep pockets. How much it costs to certify a levee varies a lot because levees are not all the same. But our research suggests that we should expect about $250,000 per mile of levee. So multiply that out over 55 miles of levee. We're looking at a need for $15 million just to do the analysis. If there are any deficiencies in those levees, to bring them up to standards, there could be significantly more cost. The only two levees in New York State that I know of that have been accredited by FEMA are the Nichols Levee, which is 1.8 miles long, and a levee in Amsterdam, which I think is about 0.6 of a mile long. So those are much smaller and simpler systems than the ones we have here in our communities. The other levee that has been certified but not yet accredited by FEMA is the Ithaca Road Levee in Horseheads. That work was done as part of a bridge project. They needed a map change so that they could complete that bridge project. FEMA gave them the conditional approval of the certification information, but as far as I know, they have not accepted the final as-built documentation and officially accredited the levee. And talking about costs, there was a lot of work that needed to be done on that levee. It had not been maintained for many years, but they spent $1.2 million on a mile of levee. So these are really expensive projects. So when FEMA held those meetings to talk to us about their levees, they talked a lot about their process. And then they took a closer look at each one of our levee systems throughout the region. For each system, they did some mapping of the blue area on this, well, the levee is in yellow. This is Gang Mills. North is not straight up like you would expect it to be. The blue area looks a lot like the current floodplain. It's confined, you know, on the river side of the levee is where the floodplain is. The dry side of the levee is out of the floodplain. When you look at the blue, and that's what they would show again if the levee is accredited. If the levee is not accredited, would use a natural, what they call a natural valley approach. Essentially, that's mapping where the water would go if there was no levee. And so in the pink there is what a future floodplain would look like, could look like in Gang Mills if we don't find the funding to get that levee certified and get it accredited by FEMA. So for each system, there's a map in those presentations similar to this to give us an idea of what we're looking at if we do not certify and accredit our levees. And they also did a profile of each levee. So the horizontal axis here is the distance along the levee, vertical is elevation. The three lines, the blue line is the base flood elevation. So that's how high that 100-year flood will be. Red line above that is their freeboard standard. For a measure of safety, the levee should be a little bit higher than the water, usually 3 feet, a little higher at bridges. So the red line is how high the levee needs to be accredited. And that gray line up the top is the levee crest data based on what they have. And the circled area, they didn't have good elevation data in that part of the levee. But this is what we want it to look like. We want the top of the levee to be way up there above the floodwater. Or at least a little bit above the floodwater. So that is the situation for the vast majority of our levees, meaning that they could be, if we can certify them, FEMA could accredit them, at least segments of them. But that's not the case everywhere. On this one, the area that they did not highlight looks good. The gray line for the crest top of the levee is above the red line for the freeboard standard. But there's a lot of other areas on this levee where, at least according to the data they were looking at, now we may find better data or different data, but we don't know. But right now, this rough cut analysis seems to suggest that the levee, top of the levee, is above the base flood elevation everywhere, but it does not have the adequate freeboard or measure of safety that they would look for to accredit it on the floodplain maps. So how would they map the floodplain in this case? They have a mapping technique that's called freeboard deficient technique. So if they do that, instead of the protected area being mapped as a zone X outside of the floodplain, it would be mapped as zone D, which is, we don't have any zone Ds in our region now. It's an area of possible but uncertain flood risk. We don't have to apply floodplain development standards in that zone D, and the mandatory flood insurance purchase requirements don't apply in that zone. So realistically, we could probably live with maps to zone D in the protected areas of the floodplain. I don't see a big problem for our communities. We would, of course, like our levees, have as much level of protection as we can get. We want that safety, but we could live with the mapping that FEMA would do in this case. And this situation applies to about 10 miles of 50 miles of levee, freeboard deficient. And moving on to the ugly. This is the Castile levee. So the flat area follows the river. The levee protects the entire village, most of the village, from the river, and then it wraps around and goes up Bennett's Creek and Purdy Creek, provide protection for the creek. So the protection level along the river is good. That gray line for the top of the levee is above the freeboard level. But as the levee follows the creeks upstream, the top of the levee is below the base flood elevation in many places, at least based on this analysis. So that means that a 100-year flood would overflow that levee. Not what we want. Next. So to show us what that means, they did a map of the floodplain with the levee, where they think the levee would overtop. The floodplain along the top of that picture, the levee along the top of that picture is protecting the village from the river. The levee on the right-hand side is a levee that goes upstream between the village and the creeks. That's the levee that they feel would overflow, but once the water gets over the levee, it's going to flow downhill and on against the levee on the river, because it won't be able to get through the levee because the river will also be high. So this can lead to significant areas of the village being included in the map regulated floodplain. Our recommendation here is that we find a way to both certify the condition of the levee and to find a way to increase the height somehow. And that could be physically changing the levee to make it higher, or maybe some holding some water back upstream in the watershed so that the volume of water that it has to contain is not as much. So we would be looking to both remediate that levee and to certify it. And this situation applies to, I find my notes. Based on those cross-set profiles that I showed you, we think about 4.4 miles of levee may have this problem where they're below the base flood elevation. But this includes 1.8 miles that are not currently accredited. So the Addison levees and levees that we're not accustomed to just having our floodplain map show us flood protection from those levees. But it also includes 1.3 miles of levees in the city of Cornell, 0.3 miles along Newtown Creek in the city of Elmira, and 1.1 mile of levee in Canasteo. That's what I'm showing you here. So what we have done is we've created a handout that describes this process, and it includes our analysis for each levee system in the region of how many feet of levee look like they may be below the base flood elevation, how many feet and where does it look like it may be above the base flood elevation but have some freeboard deficiency problems, how much is good to go. And then what are our recommendations? The recommendations almost always, except a few little segments that don't protect much, almost always we recommend certifying the levee. That's the engineering analysis to evaluate its condition. If it's just freeboard deficient, our recommendation is to explore using the freeboard deficient mapping procedure. And where it's below the base flood elevation, we would really like those problems fixed. And of course, if certification identifies any other deficiencies, we want those fixed also. these levees protect our property and they protect our lives. They're an important part of the infrastructure that keeps our communities safe. Those same recommendations are included in an online interactive map. I showed you a picture of that earlier. The link is here, and I think Liv is putting these links into the chat box, maybe as we speak. And the third link here, after the levee meetings, FEMA sent their presentation with all of those maps and the profiles to the communities. But we've collected them all and put them in a Google Drive that you can get to, so you can take a closer look at your community and what FEMA found when they evaluated the levee in your community. Oh, and also, case Montour Falls is here. In that Google Drive folder, I also included the levee report that FEMA did for about the Montour Falls levee in 2019. So that village is ahead of the rest of us on the process that FEMA is currently going through right now to evaluate. So what happens if we don't certify the levees? Protected areas likely to be included in the special flood hazard area. The floodplain development requirements would apply. Talking about downtowns of our cities and villages. Floodplain development requirements usually mean that the finished floor needs to be elevated above the flood height. So if you're near the river, near the levee, that flood height could be quite high. We don't like to go up a flight of stairs to do our commercial, our shopping in commercial districts. Another alternative for non-residential buildings is sometimes to dry flood proof, but that's most practical if the flood heights are 4 feet or less. And the idea there is to keep water out of the building instead of keeping the building above the flood height. So likely to be development that doesn't happen if we have to impose those development requirements, or redevelopment that doesn't happen. Insurance, flood insurance would be mandatory for buildings that are covered by federally backed mortgages. It would be good if all of our flood-prone buildings were covered by flood insurance, but it's not an inexpensive product. So this could be a financial hardship for many people if flood insurance is required in our levee protected areas. So would this have a chilling effect on development and redevelopment projects? Maybe. How severe would the economic impacts be? We don't really know. And if we don't certify the levees, we won't know any more than we know now about whether we're justified in trusting them. So going through that process, although it's super expensive, there would be some peace of mind that would come from knowing that our levee is a structure that we can trust. What's next? Yes, I'm hoping you guys have some ideas. We would like to meet with the agencies, particularly the Army Corps of Engineers and the Department of Environmental Conservation, because they're the ones that we've always trusted to be responsible for our levees, to take care of them, to inspect them. What are their programs? What are their recommendations? How much of the data required to be submitted to FEMA for accreditation? How much of that information exists? Can they take the lead, or at least the Army Corps, and they take the lead on, developing any additional data that's needed. So I talked about certification as something that we would have to hire, an engineer to do. But the federal regulations actually say that either needs to be information that's certified by a licensed professional engineer or provided by a federal agency with the responsibility for levees. So the Corps may be able to get us where we need to go using different techniques than if we were to hire a private engineering firm to do that. We don't know if those costs would be higher or lower. And also the Corps of Engineers still maintains some of their levees. Well, they assume more responsibility for accreditation of those systems. They have a new program, newish program, in which they do this work with a 50% cost share. I want to know more about that. I wish it was a higher percentage covered than 50%, but I guess we need to explore all our options. And we do need to explore the various funding options. What sources of funding may pay for which parts of the work that we need to have done. And I think we need to be tackling this together as a region because none of our communities have the expertise or the time or the money to do the work that needs to be done regarding our levees. And we do want them shown appropriately when we get updated.
And if Anthony and Timothy would mind either coming up and letting me know your affiliation, or if you could drop that in the chat, I would appreciate that. And then, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or drop those in the chat as well.
Give me some time in case you're typing things in. I know I'm always slow with questions. Type slow.
And Katrina did ask if we would be emailing these links, I'm assuming, yes, with the slides that folks after.
Do you have email addresses for them all? Then we can email them all. Well, I think they'll be posted on STC website. I believe a recording will also be posted. on STC website, and we'll send you those links.
Perfect. Thank you, Katrina, for joining us.
And if you have a question tomorrow instead of tonight, here's my contact information, or you can find that on the STC website and get in touch with me with any questions or suggestions or offers that you may have. And I would encourage you to take a look at your floodplain maps and your mapping issues and needs, and if you haven't already interacted with FEMA, think about whether you have any requests or suggestions for the mapping project, and make sure you get on their contact list so that you'll see the draft information when they distribute that for us to comment.
I am going to stop recording now.